Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so welcome to the August 5th short briefing on some updates with regards to activities and the general broader picture with regards to the northern part of the country. So on the latest humanitarian activities in the northern part of the country, as of yesterday, August 4th, 157 trucks of humanitarian assistance have entered the Tigray region, and these have also reached Mekelle. These trucks contain food and non-food items with the assistance of humanitarian actors like the World Food Programme, other UN agencies, and also international organizations that are working on humanitarian issues in the region. So the work on the part of the government side to enable a secure passage for humanitarian assistance continues, and the passage of these trucks and their en route into Mekelle has been also confirmed by the WFP side, I'm sure, as you have seen yesterday. Despite these efforts, though, there are still deliberate efforts to manipulate the international community into thinking that the support provisions put into place by the government to support the delivery of aid into the region are ineffective, and that other less accountable and less controlled means of delivering aid are required. So this is part of the narrative that is being exploited. However, that cannot happen, as I had also shared before with you that clear guidelines and protocols have been put in place as part of the government security measures that every stakeholder needs to adhere to when delivering humanitarian assistance into the region. So part of this narrative skewing is somehow becoming apparent as part of the TPLF nature, and it's important to go back to revisiting it because I don't think enough partners really do understand the threat that has been confronted by the government of Ethiopia and the Ethiopian people at large. So the noise being amplified by the TPLF is with regards to humanitarian assistance, and this narrative of blockage of aid is trying to bypass these protocols and guidelines that have been already put into place for security measures. In the past week, we have seen the continued bravado of the terrorist TPLF's leadership on some media outlets attempting to discredit the leadership of the government as well as the efforts that have been made. Aided by their digital foot soldiers and operatives, they have continuously skewed the narrative, posturing as righteous defenders of the people of Tigray in whose name they continue to trade. At one moment, there is a dilly-dallying between victim and victor identity. And this victor and victim identity has been their go-to strategy in attempts to accuse the administration of everything under the sun. But history does not forget, and in time the truth will continue to unveil itself to those that are momentarily taken by TPLF's propaganda. This is not new to a lot of the correspondents in this room, but I guess it's still important to reiterate that between 2005 and 2018, the people of Ethiopia made it clear that enough was enough following the TPLF's 27 years of atrocious human rights violations, disappearances, killings, forced displacements, violent crackdown on opposition, choking of democratic prospects for the country, embezzlements out of proportion, and a divide and rule approach which institutionalized ethnic profiling. So this heavy-handed and bloody approach characterized the way this organization ruled and before it was ousted, giving the fake semblance of stability and peace that it thought that it had brought. In this period, it had laid down deep networks domestically and internationally, which it continues to play like a ventriloquist towards its own destructive ambitions. So playing the unconquerable victor when it suits the international audience, and then playing the downtrodden victim again, playing into international sentiments, values, and principles is the characteristic of this terrorist organization. And I hope that the international community at this juncture will begin to wake up and see this organization for what it is, a terrorist organization that has hijacked the well-being of the people of Tigray as a means to its vicious goals. If truly TPLF was for the people of Tigray, then the millions of Tigrayans it has kept suspended for 27 years in food handouts while it overfed itself would not have continued being safety net recipients. So even though there are some who refuse to acknowledge the Ethiopian people's designation of TPLF as a terrorist organization. And the reason that I say the Ethiopian People's Designation is because it went through a constitutional process through the House of People's Representatives endorsing this designation. It has continued to show its nature and actions commensurate with such a designation. It has assassinated, abducted, wounded members of the Tigray Provisional Administration and looted their properties. In fact, most of you would be aware that last week some members of the Provisional Administration and family members of the deceased as well as abducted were out in the streets of Addis last week to share their pain, as this is not an issue that is often paid attention to and taken up. But these are civil servants who took the risk, who gambled on their lives to serve the people of Tigray within the region. This terrorist organization also continues to aggressively terrorize people within the Amhara and Afar regions, entering through obscure routes and routes that are not considered as main passageways. As a result, they have displaced more than 300,000 people in both regions as part of this belligerent encroachment. Again, together with their operatives, they have orchestrated economic sabotage through which there has been a hoarding of iron estimated by the federal police to be worth 5 billion. And they continue to use their operatives abroad to disseminate false propaganda online, attempting to incite fear about the country while influencing ill-informed policymakers with a distorted narrative. So these are some of the manifestations of terrorism, and we would be hard-pressed for other definitions if this is not considered by the international community as comprising terrorist acts. In fact, the US Department of Homeland Security, in its own policy memorandum dated June 15, 2014, you can actually look it up, had stated, and I open quote, the TPLF qualifies as a Tier 3 terrorist organization under INA Section 212 on the basis of its violent activities before it became part of the ruling coalition and the government of Ethiopia in May 1991, close quote. And true to this nature, today the same organization has continued in its inherent behavior of terrorism. So against this backdrop and the challenges that the government is confronted with a refusal by some members of the international community to call a spade, the lengths that the government has gone to support the people of Tigray are wide and far-reaching. We've shared before the efforts made by this administration to address the needs within the region after the TPLF treasonously attacked the Northern Command of the Defense Forces in November 2020. And here again, I would like to remark that why the international media and community still question TPLF's attack on the Northern Command is bewildering, particularly because there is a video testimony stated by TPLF's own members indicating that this was a preemptive attack. So I leave that as a question mark with you. In any case, following the TPLF drawing the government into its rule of law operations in the north, the government has spent close to 8 to 10 times the region's budget in relief and repair work. So this is around 100 billion birr. This includes expenditures for humanitarian assistance, delivery that have been done in 3 rounds before the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire was enacted, for health expenditures, repairing damages that had been sustained by some hospitals and health centers, as well as facilitating other forms of healthcare provision for areas in which these healthcare provisions had been suspended. Expenses related to agriculture activities. Again, this was humanitarian ceasefire that was enacted to enable the farmers of Tigray to go back and resume the agriculture activities. So these expenses also reflect that, as well as water and sanitation service provision, among other support services that were being rendered. In this regard, the government of Ethiopia still stands by its humanitarian ceasefire, whereas we still have cases in which some communities within the Amhara region and the Afar region are still encroached upon by the TPLF group and terrorizing communities, looting properties, as well as the ongoing activities that is true to the nature of a terrorist organization. Having given you this backdrop, there are some problematic framings that have emerged more prominently over the past week that also need to be addressed. And in a way, these framings are also wrongfully directed at the government. Some of these include, for example, a very bewildering public statement made one day ago referring to the situation in the north as the government's, open quote, the government's brutal campaign against the people of Tigray, close quote. So for those that know and aspire to understand Ethiopia, that understand the people-centered policy of this administration embarked upon in the past 3 years with the reforms journey, and for those that are open to moving away from very preconceived notions of what African leaders and countries are like, such statements would not have been made just matter-of-factly, because it would require understanding the nuances and a bit of an in-depth understanding. It is regrettable that African nations such as Ethiopia, and particularly Ethiopia with more than 3,000 years of a rich history, culture, and diverse people that have stood the test of time, and with a democratically elected government, is portrayed in such simplistic terms and with erroneous information as a catalyst for these kind of statements. However, it's important to articulate that if Twitter hashtags continue to be the basis of intelligence that key policymakers globally defer to in order to understand a people and a nation, then one needs to take, to look at a very truthful example of what has transpired with regards to the fake Humera massacre that has been trending by TPLF operatives for the past 2 weeks now. Our media monitoring flagged this trend on July 22, and you would know that the information outlet for the media group that has been dealing with the rule of law operations over the past 9 months had alerted a notice saying that this fake massacre in the making is underway, and it is being perpetrated or purported by digital online activists under a fake hashtag that had been trending. So after that indication from this group or the media outlet, we saw that there was a subsiding component to this trending hashtag. However, just last week again, it was revived, or a few days ago, with deplorable images that were being disseminated online, and Twitter concerns being shared by officials with botched testimonies by TPLF operatives given to international media to pepper the reporting as well. The other problematic framing which is being concocted is that the Tigray region is under a siege or a blockade by the government. And this framing is also why the TPLF waged a confrontation on the Afar entry point for humanitarian assistance. And this has been done to give the impression that the government is blocking humanitarian assistance throughout that route, thereby facilitating the demands for the opening up of other routes that in a way would be treated as a no man's land and entry point. Fortunately, as a sovereign nation, the Ethiopian government determines which route is more suitable to deliver its responsibility of humanitarian assistance. And those who want corridors for weapons and non-humanitarian goods to be routed to them continue to try and manipulate the realities on the ground in attempts to convince the world that unfettered access is not happening. Nevertheless, for those that intimately understand the working and the machinations of TPLF, they do understand that this is the modus operandi. And those who are aware of its propaganda also know how to differentiate between the wheat and the chaff in this relentless push for narrative, for distorted narrative. Lastly, on this issue, many have also made misconstrued statements, and I would rather share it and address it at this point. They have misconstrued the statements that have been made by the leadership as directed towards the people of Tigray. So words used by the leadership are being pulled out of context to fit an agenda that rings the sirens of dehumanizing rhetoric that has been referred to. And it's very clear to those that read these statements and to those that push the alarm that such statements are directed at the TPLF organization as a terrorist organization rather than the people of Tigray. So let's not also forget in this regard that both former President Obama and Vice President John Kerry have used similar terminology and phrases in the threat posed by ISIL as a terrorist organization. So these references that are being made or that are being skewed to refer to the people of Tigray is an erroneous approach, and it's the propaganda element of the TPLF wing, but they are being directed towards the organization as a terrorist organization designated within a constitutional process. On engagements with partners, I would like to reiterate that the government of Ethiopia welcomes engagements with all our international partners. These engagements will need to continue not on the path of foregone conclusions and veiled threats, but honoring the tradition, the culture, and respect that an ancient country of more than 3,000-year history warrants. So if one is looking at it only through the lens of privilege, then one may risk a myopic view of events unfolding in Ethiopia. And underhanded efforts to support the terrorist group's insurgency tactics and efforts to discredit this government will not be tolerated. There are calls for a negotiated ceasefire. However, even the government's unilateral humanitarian ceasefire has not been respected by the belligerent and terrorist group TPLF. So weaponizing humanitarian assistance by putting our people in Tigray at risk for the narrow goals of a belligerent group needs to be called out. This is not an engagement of equals, and it should not be framed as an engagement of equals, where a terrorist organization calls the shots against a legitimate and elected government. So partners who wish to work constructively and positively in support of a legitimate, democratic, and sovereign government, and importantly, in support of the Ethiopian people, will be very welcome in that constructive relationship. To finalize, I would like to emphasize that the government of Ethiopia remains committed to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country and the integrity of its borders, to upholding the rule of law together with its international obligations in foresight, and committed to observation and practice of the rule of law as a nation, because it's an essential element to statehood and to the progress that we are making, particularly after the new mandate has been bestowed upon the government by the people of Ethiopia in the 6th national elections. So the Ethiopian government remains committed to the security and safety of its population in all regions, from Tigray to the south region, west to east as well. And with these opening remarks, I will open it up for your questions. Okay, I see Brooke, Grum, Iskander, and Ravi. Brooke, you can proceed. I think maybe you could wait for a microphone to come to you. Brooke.
Okay, thank you very much. In a recent visit by the UN OCHA Under Secretary and the USAID administrator, it was stated that bureaucratic processes are hindering humanitarian access to Tigray region. So what is the government doing to ease these bureaucratic processes so that humanitarian assistance can reach Tigray very easily and quickly? And the other point is probably the humanitarian ceasefire was one reason for the declaration of humanitarian ceasefire in Tigray was to allow the people of Tigray to conduct their agricultural activities peacefully. So will this ceasefire end when the rainy season ends, or will it be extended? And probably the last point is that the international community has been calling for negotiation between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government so that peace can come to this country. And there are also reports of some efforts, for example, by the Sudanese Prime Minister Hamdok to negotiate between the TPLF and the Ethiopian government. So is this process going on, and what's the government's stance when it comes to negotiating with the TPLF? Thank you.
Okay, Brooke. Maybe I could respond to you, and then we can proceed to the other questions. The reference to the bureaucratic processes, this is something that the government does not want to hinder. Humanitarian assistance is not an obligation of international partners only. It's timely responsibility of the government, and the government takes this particularly seriously. Nobody has familiarity with conflict. Nobody has familiarity with encroachment by belligerent groups. So these systems and processes are being put in place live while these encroachments and these belligerent activities are being spearheaded by a terrorist organization. So these bureaucratic processes that are being referred to are security measures that are been put in place to safeguard the state, to safeguard its citizens as well. So there is a lot of trucks that are coming through, and the measures that need to be taken to ensure that they are aligning to the protocols and the security, the transportation protocols that have been established by the government would take due process as well. But as the weeks are ongoing, there are efforts to further facilitate and ensure that these bottlenecks are not a challenge for humanitarian partners, because they have shared this with the government as well, and the government does take it seriously and responds to that. With regards to the ceasefire, yes, it was put in place and was enacted to address to enable farmers within the Tigray region to resume farming activities. It was also put in place to enable and facilitate humanitarian assistance entry. However, as we have also shared over the past week, and as I already indicated earlier as well, there's these continued provocations by the side of the TPLF. So there is a party that is willingly taking on the responsibility, and this is a responsibility of the government to take care of its people within the Tigray region, and for those purposes, but then there is an entity that is trading in the name of the people of Tigray that is breaching all of what is being set up in order to support the people of Tigray. So it's not a matter of when the rainy season ends or not, but if these continued provocations do continue, then the government would be forced into having to consider various ways of ensuring that these provocations are minimized and the threats and the instability that has been created in these two other regions is also seized. With regards to a negotiated ceasefire, I had already mentioned that already, but your reference to whether Sudan would take part in this, I think the relationship with Sudan at this point is a little bit tricky, because the level of trust with some leaders has already been eroded. Particularly with the Sudanese army incursion into Ethiopian territory. And trust is the basis of any negotiation and any mediation as well. So that element needs to be thoroughly addressed before Sudan could be entertained as a credible party in terms of facilitating such kind of negotiations. We'll go to Groom.
Thank you so much, Groom Jara, CGTN. My question is with the peace effort that you've been talking about. A few weeks back, I think TPLF came up with 7 preconditions to be respected before it can come to a negotiating table, whichever it's going to be in the future. Will the government accept those, because we haven't heard any reactions officially? Second, will there be a precondition from the government side in order for the state to enter to any negotiation with the TPLF? Thank you.
Thank you, Guruma. I think I will answer that very quickly and shortly as well. I mentioned earlier in my opening statement as well, this is not an engagement of equals. So the 7 preconditions cannot be positioned or put forth to a legitimate government by a terrorist organization as the basis of bringing peace and stability to the region that actually requires it. But putting it back in terms of a rhetorical question, is the government did take an initial step of enacting unilateral ceasefire, but this ceasefire has not been accepted on the part of the other party. So I think the first step towards the other elements that you mentioned is first accepting that the unilateral ceasefire has to be in place to facilitate humanitarian assistance into the region and to enable farmers to resume their farming activities. Iskander and then Ravi.
Thank you very much. Ethiopian government officials have been tweeting and expressing their strong opposition to what they described as a push to open corridor via Sudan. Can you tell us what they are referring to? I mean, has there been any request from international partners to open a humanitarian corridor through Sudan? One more question. There have been circulating reports about the Prime Minister's alleged visit to the Afar front. Can you confirm that? And what was the purpose of the trip to the Afar front by the Prime Minister? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iskander. To my knowledge, there isn't any request by the international community and organizations for an alternate corridor. However, there is a building up of narrative and rhetoric and propaganda by the TPLF to indicate that the Afar route is not a safe route, and it is subject to bureaucratic bottlenecks, it's subject to seizing the region, it's subject to blockades, to give the impetus for other requests to be made for other corridors to open up. So that is part of the reflection, because I think the government as a sovereign government has the responsibility, as I stated, to deliver humanitarian assistance and to choose the route through which it is easily manageable, effective, and efficient to deliver humanitarian assistance. And at this point, considering that the Afar region is proximate to our ports in Djibouti, the government has chosen that route as an entry point for humanitarian assistance. And to your last question with regards to the PM's presence in the Afar region, yes, he was present in the Afar region on Monday. He held discussions with the leadership of the Afar region as well as elders in terms of facilitating the flow of humanitarian assistance within the Tigray region, among other issues as well. Robbie?
Thank you for the briefing. I wanted to ask about something that Muferiat, the peace minister, said last night. She said that aid can be significantly scaled up provided the TPLF adheres to the ceasefire call. And I just wanted to ask if that is in fact the federal government's position, that the ceasefire has to be respected by all parties for the humanitarian response to be significantly scaled up. And if that is the position, why would that be a requirement in Ethiopia when there are a number of other active conflicts in which humanitarian workers can still do their jobs even as fighting continues? And secondly, you mentioned that the relationship with Sudan is tricky at the moment. Is there somebody that the federal government has identified as an acceptable mediator if negotiations were to get to that stage, or the process of trying to initiate some kind of talks were to progress? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. With the statement that you made, I think it's important, and we have to be careful with the way you framed it, because from what I'm hearing, the way that you're framing it presupposes that this is a condition upon which humanitarian assistance, or the government is using it as a precondition for humanitarian assistance. And that is not the way Minister Muferiat has stated it, and that is not the position of the government. It is not a condition. Why it's being referred to as an obstacle is because of the provocations by the TPLF on these particular areas through which aid is being transported into. So it's really important to be careful with the framing around this issue. With regards to, has the Ethiopian government identified other intermediaries or middle players? I think Ethiopia, as I was saying, with a country or a heritage of more than 3,000 years, has got its own indigenous institutions, its own reconciliation mechanisms. It has elders that populations, various segments of the population do listen to. We have our own indigenous, conflict resolution mechanisms, and it's important to exhaust those means before having to look for third-party intervention outside of the country. So these are some tools that are being considered, and you will be informed with them when it's the time for that. Any other questions? Okay, we'll take one from Addis. Take one over there. Isra.
So as talks of this need for dialogue or peace circulates around, TPLF fighters continue their incursions south. Do we have any idea? Do we know the extent of the damage done already on communities in Afar and places in the Amhara region where the incursions have been made by the TPLF? And to what extent such incursions complicate humanitarian efforts by the government and partners? Thank you.
Okay, Addis. I don't think that area is particularly an area where people, can take stock of, because taking stock of these kind of things requires a sense of stability, and with continued provocations, it's really hard to take the kind of stock taking. However, I had already indicated that more than 300,000 people have been displaced from the Afar and Amhara areas in which these provocations have continued by the TPLF. Farmers' livelihoods have been disrupted within the Amhara region. Pastoralist community within the Afar region have also been disrupted. So this gives you a perspective of the damage that these pockets of resistance from the TPLF is creating, again backed by human shields and human waves, or utilizing the citizens of Tigray and the people of Tigray as human shields and waves.
Thank you. I'm Solomon Daniel from ATV English. One of the government ministers, Zadig Abraha, told the BBC a couple of days ago that if the government runs out of patience, it will destroy the TPLF within 2 weeks. And now you're telling us that hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, properties have been looted. Isn't it enough for the government to run out of patience? And when will the government run out of patience and purge the TPLF within 2 weeks, if it is as simple as that? And we're hearing that the TPLF forces are advancing towards the town of Waldea. What is going on there, really? Is it because the federal forces are conceding defeat, or it's just a tactical retreat? And one last question. There is a widespread speculation that the US and its allies are desperate to topple.
Sorry, I didn't get that part. Can you say it again? There's
There-
widespread speculation?
There is a widespread speculation that the US and its allies are desperate to topple Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Has your office seen any signal that corroborates with the speculation? Thank you.
Okay. You continue with 3-part questions. We'll take one last question from you. Go ahead.
I'm from Al Jazeera. There was a request by parents from other regions who have students in Mekelle University for a safe passage for them out of Mekelle.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe to get the mask.
Parents from other regions who have students in Mekelle University have been requesting for their kids to have a safe passage out of Mekelle. Have a solution been provided for this?
Okay. There's one last question over here.
Thank you very much. And I'm from New Business Ethiopia. I have a couple of questions. The first one is with regards to the recent report by Geopolitics Press, which stated that there is a covert operation ongoing based in Nairobi, which has networks all over the world, which is trying to disseminate, fabricate false information regarding your administration. So how do you see this in relation to the question that's raised, which could probably lead to the toppling of the Prime Minister? The other is there are 3 aid agencies that are being banned recently for engaging in illegal activities. What's your comment on that? Will there be a discussion to bring them back to their operation? And the other is with regard to the US-Ethiopia relation. There seems to be a growing or mounting pressure from the US side on your government's administration. Do you see any improvement in the near future with this relation, or do you see it deteriorating based on the statements coming from some US officials against your government? Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the first question that had come in, and this aspect of running out of patience. I think it's not a matter of running out of patience, but the care and the concern that the government has for the people of Tigray, who are literally been taken hostage by a terrorist organization, is something that is quite prominent. So I don't want to get into the debate of 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or whatsoever, but the government is in full form and posture to have to effectively neutralize the threat that TPLF puts forth. But like I said, the unilateral ceasefire is still something that's quite prominent at this point in time. To what extent would the unilateral ceasefire keep holding while these provocations keep continuing is going to be at the discretion of the National Security Council. You talk about advancements and TPLF taking hold of certain parts of the Amhara region, Waldea and whatsoever. And I think it's important here again, which I was referring to earlier on in terms of characteristics and manifestations of terrorism, because there is overt terrorism, which is provocations. You go with the with the gun, you terrorize people in that way, you loot properties. The other form of terrorism is the psychological terrorism, which is giving the impression that you're bigger than what you are, and seeding doubts within communities to give them the impression that there is something threatening that is coming towards them. The information that I have with regards to Waldia is that there is no such threat at this point in time from the TPLF. With regards to the speculation, I cannot, in this position, entertain speculations or respond to speculations because they remain as speculations. The question that were raised from Al Jazeera with regards to university students in the Tigray region, the Ministry of Education has held various consultations with the parents of these university students, and there are continued efforts to address that, and there has been also some progresses in that regard. So when it's due time, the Ministry of Education would provide you with more details. The geopolitical press aspect that you raised in terms of covert operations, again, I cannot speak to what others publish, but I can give you the perspective that somehow it falls into the perspective that we hold, that Ethiopia is being depicted and portrayed and represented in a very inaccurate way. And this is being channeled through lobbyist firms that the PLF have hired through looted money from the coffers of the nation. It is being channeled through their operatives and their agents that they have established long-standing relations with over the past 27 years of their tenure. So I cannot undermine that there might be these kind of things, but in terms of the overt expressions, particularly in the portrayal of Ethiopia on the international stage, I do believe that there is an orchestrated engagement to tarnish the reputation of the Prime Minister, the administration, as well as the country. The Prime Minister has not changed from 3 years ago. He is the same person. The administration has not changed from the past 3 years. They're still committed to the reforms and the democratization of this country. The perspective has changed, and the way that it's being narrated, the way that TPLF propagandists are pushing a false narrative has contributed to that. So this is an opportunity for particularly policymakers and those who are in decision-making capacity within the international community to separate, as I was saying earlier, between the wheat and the chaff, because it's really important in this age of disinformation perpetrated within social media to be aware of what are the nuances and the context of this country, and particularly personalities as well. And as I was saying, the government remains very open to engage in a constructive manner with those that want to understand better what's happening on the ground. And this falls again with regards to the question you raised with US-Ethiopia relations. This is one of the most important strategic relationships and partnership that Ethiopia has, and based on a constructive engagement, we do believe that there is something to build upon. So I think we'll wrap it up with these responses, and we'll come back again at another point in time. Thank you. The aid agencies. So the civil society organization, or the body that is the one that is responsible for monitoring their activities, has already shared, or through the media fact check has already been issued, what the challenges were, particularly on MSF Holland and the Norwegian Refugee Council. They have been talked to before by the responsible agency. So they have been accused of disseminating misinformation on social media and other platforms that goes beyond the mandate of the operations for which they are registered within the country. Secondly, they have been employing foreign nationals without the required paperwork for the duration of over 6 months as well. And then thirdly, particularly MSF Holland has been charged with or accused of illegally importing and using satellite radio equipment, which was not authorized by the relevant authority, and this is the Ethiopian Communications Authority. So yes, it might seem, for somebody who's not going in depth at the suspension of these organizations, because this is a suspension subject to review and subject to these organizations taking retroactive measures. But the charity organization had been warning them ahead of time that these were some breaches according to the lands of the law, and because they were not paying attention to these breaches, then the suspension has to be put in effect. And whether it's MSF, whether it's Norwegian Refugee Council, or any other NGO that is operating within this country has to adhere to the laws of the land, because this is not a no man's land. and the perspective of exceptions to any particular rules should not be expected of an African country because it is African, because these kind of same rules also exist in other parts of the world as well. So these organizations need to adhere to that, and then in consultation with the parent organization as part of the government, they will be able to address whatever issues outstanding for their suspension. Thank you.